The briefcase snapped shut with a soft click. Inside, stacks of crisp $100 bills gleamed under the dim light of the judge's office. Senator Richard Wallace wiped the sweat off his brow. His heart pounded like a war drum. He had spent years building his empire, siphoning millions from government funds, hiding the money in offshore accounts, and living a life of luxury while the people he was supposed to serve struggled. And now, it had all caught up to him. The FBI had evidence. The trial was tomorrow. If convicted, he'd spend the rest of his life in prison. But that wasn't going to happen. Across from him, Judge Malcolm Whitaker leaned forward, his greedy eyes locked on the briefcase. He hesitated only for a second before reaching out, his fingers trembling. "This is substantial," Judge Whitaker murmured, flipping through the stacks of bills. "It's yours," Richard whispered urgently. "You make this case disappear, and I'll make sure there's more where that came from." The judge exhaled sharply, then looked Richard in the eye. "You have a deal." Richard grinned. Relief flooded his body. He had done it. He had outplayed the system once again. But what neither of them knew was that someone was watching. A faint red light blinked from the corner of the judge's office, a tiny hidden camera. And on the other end, someone was recording everything. The sun was shining brightly on the steps of the courthouse earlier that morning. Reporters swarmed outside like vultures, cameras flashing, microphones shoved into the faces of lawyers and officials. The entire country was watching as Senator Richard Wallace walked inside, his tailored suit perfectly pressed, his expression calm and collected. To the public, he was a man of power, a leader, someone who fought for the people. But behind closed doors, Richard was a thief, a liar, and now a desperate man. His crimes had finally caught up to him. For years, he had been embezzling money from government funds, using fake contracts, ghost companies, and insider deals to funnel millions into his own pockets. He had covered his tracks well, until now. A whistleblower had come forward. The FBI had launched an investigation, and now he was facing trial. His only hope was Judge Malcolm Whitaker, a man known for his expensive tastes and quiet corruption. Richard had pulled some strings, set up a secret meeting at the judge's private office late that night. He wasn't going down without a fight. Hours before the secret meeting, Richard sat in his office, fingers drumming against his mahogany desk. His lawyer, Jordan Keller, sat across from him, flipping through stacks of legal documents. "Richard," Jordan said, his voice low, "this case is airtight. The evidence against you is overwhelming. If we go to trial—" "I'm not going to trial," Richard cut in sharply, his jaw clenched. "I have other ways to handle this." Jordan sighed. He had been Richard's lawyer for years. He knew exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. "This is dangerous. If you get caught, I won't." Richard had always been good at playing the game. He knew how to twist the law, bend people to his will. And if a little money was the price for his freedom, then so be it. That night, Richard arrived at Judge Whitaker's office with the briefcase in hand. The room was dark, save for the dim glow of a desk lamp. The air smelled of expensive cigars and old paper. Judge Whitaker sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Richard felt a flicker of doubt. What if the judge refused? What if this backfired? He shook the thought away. He had no other choice. The bribe was made. The deal was sealed. And someone was watching. The man behind the hidden camera smirked as he watched the footage. He had been following Richard for weeks, tracking his every move. He had suspected corruption. But this was gold. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he saved the recording. He wasn't sure what he was going to do with it yet. But one thing was certain. Richard Wallace had no idea what was coming for him. The next morning, Richard Wallace woke up feeling lighter than he had in weeks. The bribe was done. The judge had taken the money. His trial was supposed to start today. But now, everything would be handled behind closed doors. He smirked as he sipped his coffee, looking out over the city skyline from his penthouse balcony. The world still belonged to him. Or so he thought. At that same moment, across town, an anonymous email landed in the inbox of the Washington Times. The subject line was simple: Senator Richard Wallace, caught in the act. Inside was a video attachment. Reporter Lisa Monroe clicked on it, her eyes widening as she watched. It was clear as day, Richard Wallace, slipping a briefcase full of cash to Judge Malcolm Whitaker. Their conversation was recorded perfectly. Every word, every exchange. Lisa's heart pounded. This was explosive. A sitting senator bribing a judge? This could bring down an entire empire. She grabbed her phone and dialed her editor. Tom, you need to see this. Now. Back at the courthouse, Richard arrived with his lawyer, Jordan Keller, both wearing confident smirks. The trial was scheduled to begin in an hour, but Richard knew it would be delayed, maybe even dismissed altogether. All he had to do was sit tight and let the judge take care of things. But the moment they stepped inside, something felt off. The energy in the room was strange. Court officials were whispering. Journalists were typing furiously. The security guard seemed extra alert. Then, Richard saw him. FBI Special Agent Mark Calloway, standing near the entrance, arms crossed. His sharp eyes locked onto Richard like a predator watching its prey. Richard's stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. Before he could react, a voice echoed through the hallway. Senator Wallace, can you comment on the video? The words hit him like a bullet. What? Richard turned, but before he could see who had spoken, another voice followed. Louder, more aggressive. Are you going to resign? Did you bribe Judge Whitaker? Richard's breath caught in his throat. The cameras, the reporters, the flashing lights. And then, Lisa Monroe, stepping forward, holding up her phone, the screen playing his video. His face, his voice, his crime. Exposed. Just 12 hours ago, Richard had been in complete control. Now, he was drowning. Richard, Jordan muttered under his breath. We need to get out of here. But before they could move, Agent Calloway stepped in front of them. Going somewhere, Senator? His tone was casual, but his eyes were deadly serious. Richard tried to keep his cool. Agent Calloway, I don't know what these reporters are talking about, but I have a trial to attend. Calloway smirked. Oh, there won't be a trial today. Something cold ran down Richard's spine. What do you mean? Calloway leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough that only Richard and Jordan could hear. The judge you bribed? He's being questioned right now. I'd love to chat with you, too. Richard's vision blurred for a second. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. He felt the walls closing in. This wasn't how today was supposed to go. He was supposed to be free. Not trapped. Not hunted. And definitely not caught. Then came the final blow. Senator Wallace, Calloway said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. You're under arrest. The cold steel of the handcuffs snapped around Richard Wallace's wrists. The sound echoed through the courthouse, louder than the whispers, louder than the gasps from the reporters, louder than the pounding of his own heart. No, no, no. This isn't happening, Richard muttered under his breath. His mind raced, searching for a way out, a loophole, an excuse, anything. But it was too late. FBI agent Mark Calloway gripped his arm tightly, leading him through the crowd. Cameras flashed like a thunderstorm. Reporters shoved microphones in his face, shouting questions that blurred together into a chaotic roar. Senator Wallace, did you bribe Judge Whitaker? Was this part of a larger corruption scheme? Do you have anything to say to the American people? Richard clenched his jaw, refusing to answer. He had to think. He had to fix this. The black SUV carrying Richard sped through the streets of Washington, D.C., heading straight for the FBI field office. He sat in the back seat, staring out the window, his mind racing. Beside him, Agent Calloway sat in silence, watching him closely. Richard could feel it, the way Calloway studied his every movement, as if waiting for him to crack. He wouldn't. He was Richard Wallace. He didn't lose. You seem quiet, Senator, Calloway finally said. Richard smirked, though his stomach was twisting. I have nothing to say without my lawyer. Calloway chuckled. Oh, don't worry. He's on his way. But between you and me, he leaned in slightly. You're finished. Richard forced himself to laugh. You must be new at this, Agent. Men like me don't go down that easily. Calloway smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. You're right. Usually, they have enough time to make a few calls before it all collapses. But you? You got caught on tape. Richard's smirk faltered. You think a little video is enough to bring me down? Calloway raised an eyebrow. It's not just a little video, Senator. It's everything. Richard swallowed hard. Something in Calloway's tone sent a chill down his spine. What did he mean by everything? Meanwhile, back at the courthouse, Judge Malcolm Whitaker sat in an interrogation room, his hands trembling. He had been pulled from his office before he even had a chance to react to the news of the leaked video. Now, he was trapped in a small, windowless room with two federal agents staring at him like wolves watching a wounded deer. He licked his dry lips. I don't know what you want from me. Agent Rebecca Lawson leaned forward. Come on, Judge. We both know that's a lie. His voice cracked. He was sweating through his robe. We have the footage, Agent Lawson continued. You taking the bribe. Your conversation with Wallace. The whole world has seen it. Judge Whitaker felt like he was sinking. His career, his life, everything he had built, gone. But here's the thing, Lawson said, tilting her head. Richard Wallace? He's a big fish. But we want all the fish. Whitaker's breath hitched. What are you saying? Agent Lawson slid a document across the table. A deal. Whitaker stared at the paper, then at the agents. If you tell us everything, who else is involved, how deep this goes, then maybe, just maybe, you won't spend the rest of your life rotting in prison. Whitaker felt his stomach churn. This wasn't just about Wallace. This was about everyone. If he talked, powerful men would come after him. But if he didn't, his hands shook as he picked up the pen. At the FBI headquarters, Richard was led into an interrogation room. His lawyer, Jordan Keller, was already waiting inside. Jordan's face was unreadable. Richard sat down, locking eyes with him. Tell me you have good news. Jordan exhaled slowly. We're in deep trouble, Richard. Richard scowled. That's not what I asked. The video is just the beginning, Jordan said. They have more. Richard's heart skipped a beat. More. Jordan leaned in. They have bank records, wire transfers, offshore accounts, a full timeline of your embezzlement. They even have evidence linking you to other judges. Richard's blood ran cold. How? He whispered. Jordan shook his head. I don't know. Someone must have been tracking you for months, maybe even years. And worst of all, he lowered his voice. Whitaker is talking. Richard felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. No. Judge Whitaker was supposed to protect him. He was supposed to keep his mouth shut. Richard slammed his fist on the table. That coward. Jordan gave him a sharp look. You need to calm down. Calm down? My entire career is burning to the ground, Jordan. I'm one of the most powerful men in this country. I can't just let them take me down like this. Jordan sighed. You have two options. 1. Fight this and risk a lifetime in prison. Or 2. Cooperate. Cut a deal before they turn you into the fall guy for everything. Richard's hands clenched into fists. He had spent years building his empire. He had spent decades becoming untouchable. And now? Now, he was trapped. But then, an idea hit him. A risky, dangerous, insane idea. One that could change everything. He leaned forward. I have a third option, he said slowly. Jordan frowned. What? Richard's lips curled into a dangerous smirk. I disappear. Jordan's eyes widened. Richard. But before he could finish, the door swung open. Agent Calloway stepped inside, holding a thick file. His expression was calm. Too calm. Richard's smirk faded. Because the look in Calloway's eyes told him something he wasn't expecting. Something far worse than an arrest. You might want to sit down for this, Calloway said. And Richard knew. Whatever was in that file was about to change everything. Richard Wallace sat stiffly in the interrogation room, his lawyer Jordan Keller beside him, the tension in the air so thick it felt like a noose tightening around his neck. FBI agent Mark Calloway dropped the thick file onto the table with a dull thud. His piercing gaze didn't waver as he pulled out a single sheet of paper and slid it across to Richard. Richard glanced at it, and his breath caught in his throat. It was a death certificate. James Callahan, deceased. Cause of death, homicide. Richard's hands went clammy. He barely managed to keep his expression neutral. What's this? He asked, though he already knew. Calloway leaned in, lowering his voice. This, Senator, is what happens when people like you get too greedy. Richard swallowed hard. James Callahan had been a whistleblower, a government accountant who had uncovered discrepancies in federal funds, money that Richard had funneled into his secret offshore accounts. And then Callahan had disappeared. Officially, it had been ruled a carjacking gone wrong. But Richard had always known the truth. He had made a call, hired the right people, and Callahan had been silenced before he could testify. He thought it had been handled. But now the FBI had the case reopened. We found new evidence, Calloway continued. Security footage from a nearby gas station. Witness testimony. Phone records. He smiled coldly. You were careful, but not careful enough. Richard's mind was spinning. Bribing a judge was one thing. Embezzling government money was another. But murder? That was the kind of crime that would put him on death row. Beside him, Jordan shifted uncomfortably. You can't pin this on my client, he said firmly. There's no direct link. Calloway cut him off. Maybe not yet. He tapped the thick file. But we're close. And when we have what we need, Richard Wallace won't just be a corrupt politician. He'll be a murderer. Richard forced himself to stay calm. He had faced pressure before. He had escaped worse situations. But something in Calloway's tone sent a cold fear through him. Because Calloway wasn't bluffing. And Richard knew. If he didn't act fast, he was a dead man walking. 3 hours later, Richard was back in a holding cell, pacing like a caged animal. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his mind racing with possibilities. He needed a way out. Fast. Bribing the judge had failed. The press had turned against him. His own lawyer looked ready to jump ship. But there was still one move left. Escape. He had money stashed in secret locations. Fake passports. Private jets. If he could get out of the country, he could disappear. He would never see prison. He just needed someone on the outside to help. And he knew exactly who to call. Somewhere in Washington, D.C., a burner phone rang in a dimly lit apartment. A man picked it up. His voice was calm. You shouldn't be calling me. Richard's voice was tight. I don't have a choice. A pause. Then, you're in trouble. Richard exhaled sharply. That's an understatement. Another pause. Then, the man spoke again. What do you need? Richard's eyes flickered toward the security camera in the corner of his cell. He lowered his voice. An exit plan. The man on the other end didn't hesitate. Done. Richard's grip on the phone tightened. And one more thing. What? Richard's lips curled into a wicked smile. I want Calloway taken care of. Back at the FBI headquarters, Agent Calloway sat at his desk, flipping through the thick case file. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered cautiously. Calloway. A distorted voice came through. You don't know me, Agent, but I know you. Calloway tensed. Who is this? The voice chuckled. A friend. A concerned friend. Let's just say, you should be very careful. There's a price on your head. Calloway's grip on the phone tightened. Is that a threat? No. It's a warning. The line went dead. Calloway stared at his phone, his mind working fast. Richard Wallace was desperate, and desperate men did dangerous things. Calloway stood, grabbing his gun. He had a feeling this case was far from over. That night, in the shadows of Washington, D.C., a black SUV pulled up to a private airstrip. A man stepped out, wearing a dark hoodie, his face hidden. He pulled out his phone and sent a single message. Everything is in place. Wallace will be free in 24 hours. He slipped back into the SUV and disappeared into the night. And just like that, Richard Wallace's escape was in motion. Richard Wallace sat in his holding cell, staring at the clock on the wall. Every tick of the second hand felt like a countdown to his escape. 24 hours. That's how long he had before everything changed. He leaned back against the cold metal bench, forcing himself to stay calm. He had called in the right people, the ones who specialized in making problems disappear. If everything went according to plan, he'd be gone before sunrise. And Calloway? Calloway wouldn't live long enough to see him brought to trial. Richard smirked. This wasn't over. Not even close. FBI agent Mark Calloway didn't sleep that night. The phone call had rattled him more than he wanted to admit. A price on his head. He had spent years taking down criminals, putting away corrupt politicians, exposing dirty cops. He had been threatened before, but something about this felt different, bigger, more dangerous. He sat in his office, staring at the case files spread across his desk. There were too many moving parts, too many people who wanted Richard Wallace to walk free. And if Wallace had called in a hit, Calloway was running out of time. He needed to move fast. Reaching for his phone, he dialed a number. Lawson, came the voice on the other end. Meet me at Wallace's holding cell, Calloway said. Now. By the time Calloway and Agent Rebecca Lawson arrived, the security team outside Wallace's cell looked uneasy. Something wrong? Calloway asked. One of the guards shifted. Wallace has been too calm. Calloway's eyes narrowed. He stepped up to the cell door and knocked on the bars. Wallace sat up slowly, giving him a lazy smirk. Agent Calloway, can't get enough of me? Calloway studied him carefully. Wallace looked relaxed. Too relaxed. Something was wrong. I have a feeling you know something I don't, Calloway said. Wallace chuckled. Maybe, maybe not. Calloway turned to the guards. I want 24-hour surveillance on him. No breaks. No rotations. I want at least 2 agents here at all times. The guards exchanged glances. Sir, is there a threat? Calloway didn't answer, because he already knew the truth. Wallace wasn't planning to stand trial. He was planning to disappear. Meanwhile, on the other side of Washington, D.C., a dark figure moved through the shadows of a secure parking garage. He approached a black van and tapped the window twice. A man inside the van rolled it down. Is it set? The figure nodded. Wallace will be out tonight. No hiccups. And Calloway? A pause. Then, he won't see tomorrow. The man in the van smirked. Good. He started the engine, pulling out of the garage and vanishing into the night. The plan was in motion. Nothing could stop it now. 3 hours later, in the FBI holding facility, the lights flickered. It was subtle at first, just a brief dimming, then back to normal. No one thought much of it. Then it happened again, and again. In the security control room, a technician frowned at the monitors. What's going on with the power? Another guard shrugged. Probably just a minor surge. But as he said the words, the screens glitched. Then, the entire facility went dark. In the hallway outside Wallace's cell, the emergency backup lights flickered on, casting eerie red glows along the walls. The guards reached for their radios. Static. Something's wrong, one of them muttered. That was when they heard it. A faint hiss, followed by a wave of dizziness. Gas. The guards barely had time to react before they collapsed, unconscious before they hit the floor. Inside his cell, Richard Wallace grinned. Right on schedule. A second later, a figure appeared at the bars, wearing a gas mask. Let's go, the man said, pulling out a key card. The cell door slid open. Richard stepped out, stretching his arms. I was getting sick of this place. The masked man handed him a black hoodie. We need to move. We have a 5-minute window before the feds recover. Richard pulled on the hoodie and followed the man down the darkened hallways. This was it. He was free. And once he was out of the country, he would make sure Calloway never chased him again. But what Richard didn't know was that Calloway wasn't in the facility. He had already seen the escape coming, and he was waiting. Outside the FBI building, the black escape van pulled up. Richard slipped into the back seat, breathing hard. The driver, a grizzled man with a scar down his cheek, glanced at him. Did anyone see you? Richard smirked. No one who's still conscious. The van sped off into the night. For the first time in weeks, Richard felt in control again. Then, the entire vehicle jerked violently to a stop. A spotlight beamed down from above. Richard's stomach dropped. Helicopters. FBI SUVs surrounded them within seconds. And standing at the front, gun drawn, was Agent Calloway. Richard's blood turned to ice. This wasn't an escape. This was a trap. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Richard Wallace sat in the back of the black van, his heart pounding as the helicopter above blasted its searchlight onto them. FBI SUVs blocked every possible exit, their red and blue lights flashing like sirens of doom. And then there was Calloway, standing in front of the blockade, gun drawn, his face unreadable. Richard's throat went dry. This wasn't an escape. This was a setup. The driver cursed, gripping the steering wheel. What the hell? We checked the routes. No one knew. Clearly, someone did, Richard growled. His mind raced. This was impossible. They had planned every detail down to the second. So how did Calloway know? Before he could think further, the SUV doors flew open. FBI agents swarmed them like a pack of wolves, their guns raised. Out of the vehicle. Now. The driver reached for something under his seat. Big mistake. Bang. The gunshot rang out, deafening inside the tight space. Blood sprayed across the dashboard as the driver slumped forward, a bullet clean through his head. The masked man beside Richard barely had time to react before the agents dragged him out, slamming him to the pavement. That left Richard. He inhaled sharply. He had one shot at this. As soon as the agents yanked open his door, Richard lunged. He threw himself at the nearest FBI agent, knocking him off balance. In the chaos, he snatched the agent's gun and swung it toward Calloway. "Stand down," Richard roared, holding the gun with shaking hands. Nobody move. Every agent froze, their weapons still locked on him. Calloway, however, didn't even flinch. "Put it down, Wallace," he said calmly. "It's over." Richard's breath was ragged. His mind was in overdrive. He needed a way out. There had to be one. But deep down, he knew. There wasn't. No private jets. No offshore accounts. No secret phone calls could save him now. "Don't do this," Calloway said again, taking a slow step forward. Richard's fingers tensed on the trigger. He could end this. Right here. One shot. But as he stared into Calloway's eyes, something inside him twisted. For the first time in his life, Richard Wallace felt helpless, like a man who had already lost. His hands trembled, and then he let the gun drop. The clatter of metal on pavement was the only sound for a long, unbearable moment. Then, FBI agents rushed him. Richard hit the ground hard as they pinned him, twisting his arms behind his back. He felt the cold steel of handcuffs snap around his wrists for the second time that day. But this time, there was no escape plan. This time, there was no coming back. 20 minutes later, Richard sat in the back of an armored FBI transport, his hands shackled in front of him. Across from him, Calloway watched in silence. Richard let out a bitter laugh. "I have to know," he muttered. "How did you know?" Calloway leaned back. "The second the lights flickered, I knew you had someone on the inside. So I let you think you were escaping. Let you run. Right into a cage." Richard scoffed. "So this was all? A trap?" Calloway confirmed. "And you walked right into it." Richard clenched his fists. He had never been beaten like this. And yet, somehow, Calloway had outplayed him. The realization made him sick. "So what now?" Richard asked, voice low. Calloway smirked. "Now? You go away for a long, long time." Richard stared at him. And for the first time in his life, he had no words. No excuses. No tricks. Nothing. The FBI transport rumbled down the highway toward its destination. The federal penitentiary. Richard Wallace wasn't a senator anymore. He was a prisoner. And this time, there was no bribing his way out. The iron doors of the federal penitentiary slammed shut behind Richard Wallace with a finality that sent chills down his spine. He stood there, dressed in an orange jumpsuit, his wrists still cuffed in front of him. The air smelled of sweat, disinfectant, and something rotten lurking beneath it all, something that made his stomach churn. This wasn't some temporary holding cell at the FBI office. This was prison. The real deal. A place where men like him, powerful men, either adapted or were destroyed. Richard was led through the main hall, his every step echoing off the concrete walls. Prisoners lined up along the upper levels, leaning over railings, watching him. Some whispered, some grinned, and then one of them shouted, "Look who it is, Senator Wallace." Laughter erupted. A chorus of jeers followed. "Didn't think we'd see you here, huh, politician? Bet he thought he was untouchable." Richard kept his face neutral. He refused to react. He wasn't about to let these animals see him sweat. But deep inside, fear crawled through his veins. Some of these men? He put them here. And they hadn't forgotten. As Richard was led to his cell, the guard escorting him sneered, Guess that fancy suit couldn't save you, huh? Richard ignored him. He had bigger problems. They stopped at a cell near the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. The door buzzed open. "Home sweet home," the guard said mockingly, shoving Richard inside before slamming the door shut. Richard looked around. It was small. A metal bunk, a toilet, a sink. The walls were covered in scratches, initials carved deep into the concrete, reminders of men who had been here before him. He sat down on the thin mattress, staring at the wall. This was his life now, and he had no way out. Or so he thought. 3 days passed. Richard kept his head down, didn't talk much, ate his meals in silence. But he wasn't stupid. He knew the rules of places like this. You had to choose a side, or you'd end up dead. And on the 4th day, someone came to offer him one. It happened during lunch. Richard sat at a corner table, pushing his food around his tray, pretending not to notice the eyes watching him. Then, a shadow loomed over him. He looked up. A massive man with a shaved head and tattoos covering his arms sat across from him. His name was Viktor Mikhailov, a Russian mob boss, one of the most feared men in the prison. And he was smiling. "Senator Wallace," Viktor said in a thick accent. "You look uncomfortable." Richard said nothing. Viktor chuckled. "Prison is dangerous for men like you." Richard finally spoke. "I can handle myself." Viktor raised an eyebrow. "No, you can't." He leaned forward. "You're not a criminal. You're a politician. And that means you don't belong here." Richard's jaw clenched. "I can help you," Viktor said, his voice smooth. "But first, you must help me." Richard knew what this was. A deal, just like the ones he used to make outside. Only this time, the cost wasn't money. It was his life. Richard stared at Viktor. "What do you want?" Viktor's smile widened, and Richard knew whatever came next would change everything. Richard Wallace had made deals before. He had bribed judges, stolen millions, and lied to the public without a second thought. But sitting across from Viktor Mikhailov in that prison cafeteria, he realized this was different. This wasn't politics. This was survival. Viktor leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You want to live, Senator? You work for me." Richard kept his face unreadable, but his mind was racing. He knew who Viktor was. A Russian mobster, convicted of arms dealing, drug trafficking, and at least 3 murders. He ran the prison from the inside. The guards turned a blind eye. His men controlled the contraband, the fights, even who lived or died. Richard had spent years thinking men like Viktor were beneath him. Now, Viktor held all the power. Richard exhaled. "And if I say no?" Viktor's smile didn't fade. "Then I give your name to the men who want you dead." Simple. Direct. A death sentence. Richard's fingers clenched under the table. He had no choice. "What do you want from me?" he asked. Viktor's eyes gleamed. "Connections." Richard frowned. "What do you mean?" Viktor leaned in. "You were a senator. You had access to politicians, judges, businessmen." He smiled. "I want names. People we can use. And people we can destroy." Richard's blood ran cold. He knew exactly what Viktor was asking for. Information. Blackmail. And Richard had plenty of it. He had spent years building relationships with powerful people, many of them just as corrupt as he was. If he gave Viktor the right names, he could ruin lives. But if he didn't, Viktor would ruin his. Richard stared at him. "You expect me to betray the people who still have influence?" Viktor shrugged. "They abandoned you, yes? Left you to rot in here?" Richard didn't answer. Because the truth was, Viktor was right. None of the people he had once called allies had come to save him. Not the billionaires who had funded his campaigns. Not the lobbyists who had once hung on his every word. Not the fellow senators who had cheered his downfall. Richard was alone. A fallen king. Viktor tilted his head. "So, Senator, what will it be?" A long silence passed. Then, Richard Wallace made the deal. That night, Richard lay awake in his cell. He had crossed a line. He had spent years manipulating people, but this was different. He was no longer in control. Viktor owned him now. And in prison? That was more dangerous than any FBI agent, any judge, any scandal, because Viktor never let go of his pawns. The next morning, Richard was approached by a prison guard. "Wallace," the guard said, "you have a visitor." Richard frowned. A visitor? No one had come to see him since his arrest. He followed the guard down the long, gray hallway until they reached a private meeting room. Inside, sitting across the table, was Jordan Keller, his old lawyer. Richard narrowed his eyes as he sat down. "You've got some nerve showing up here." Jordan folded his hands. "You and I need to talk." Richard scoffed. "About what?" "How you left me to rot." Jordan exhaled sharply. "No, Richard. About something much bigger." Richard frowned. "What are you talking about?" Jordan hesitated, then slid a folder across the table. Richard opened it, and his stomach dropped. Inside was a list of names. Judges, FBI agents, political figures, and one name at the bottom, Viktor Mikhailov. Richard's head snapped up. "Where did you get this?" Jordan's face was grim. "This is the list that got you caught." Richard's breath hitched. "What?" Jordan nodded. "Someone leaked it. It's why the FBI came after you so fast. And now," he took a deep breath, "it's why they want you dead." Richard's pulse pounded. This wasn't just about his trial. This wasn't just about his money. This was bigger. Someone had set him up. Someone wanted him gone. And now, he was sitting in a prison run by one of the men on that list. Richard suddenly felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, and the ground beneath him was crumbling. He looked Jordan in the eye. "Who did this?" Jordan hesitated. Then he said a name, and Richard's world collapsed. The name Jordan Keller spoke sent an icy dagger through Richard Wallace's chest. He stared at his former lawyer, trying to process the words. "That's not possible," Richard muttered. Jordan exhaled. "I thought the same thing. But it all leads back to them." Richard shook his head, refusing to believe it, because the name Jordan had just said, the person responsible for setting him up, for leaking the names, for sending the FBI after him, was someone Richard trusted, someone who had everything to lose if he went down, someone who had once called him a friend. Senator Andrew Dalton, Richard's former ally, his biggest supporter, the man who had promised to help him get out of this mess. And now, the man who had betrayed him. Richard gritted his teeth, his fists clenching against the cold steel table. "This doesn't make sense," he growled. "Dalton and I built this empire together. He's as guilty as I am." Jordan nodded. "Exactly. That's why he did it." Richard's head snapped up. Jordan slid another file across the table. Inside were documents, financial records, secret correspondences. And at the center of it all, Andrew Dalton's signature. Jordan's voice was grim. "He cut a deal, Richard. A full deal. He gave them everything they needed to take you down. In exchange, they let him walk away clean." Richard's stomach churned. Andrew Dalton, the man who had helped him steal millions. The man who had benefited from every dirty deal Richard had ever made. The man who had been right beside him when they crafted the entire scheme. And he had sold him out. Rage burned in Richard's veins. Dalton had played the game smarter. While Richard had been fighting to escape, Dalton had been negotiating his freedom. And now, Richard was rotting in prison, while Dalton sat comfortably in his mansion, free and untouchable. Richard's breath was heavy. "Where is he now?" Jordan hesitated. "That's where things get complicated." Richard's eyes darkened. "What do you mean?" Jordan leaned in. "Dalton isn't just sitting back enjoying his freedom, Richard. He's running for president." Richard's world spun. He jerked his head up, staring at Jordan in disbelief. "You're lying." Jordan slid a newspaper across the table. Right on the front page, in bold letters, "Senator Andrew Dalton announces 2028 presidential campaign." Richard's blood boiled. Not only had Dalton betrayed him, he was using Richard's downfall as a stepping stone to the White House. Everything suddenly made sense. Dalton had always planned to be the one left standing. He had let Richard take all the heat. He had fed the FBI every piece of dirt they needed to bury him. And now? Now, he was going to walk away as a hero, the senator who had helped take down corruption in Washington. Richard's hands trembled. But it wasn't fear. It was rage. A slow, burning, unrelenting rage. Dalton thought he had one. But Richard Wallace wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. He leaned forward, his voice low and deadly. How do I get out of here? Jordan's eyes flickered with hesitation. Richard, I don't care what it takes, Richard interrupted. I don't care who I have to betray, who I have to use, or who I have to destroy. His lips curled into a dark smile. I'm not just going to escape. His voice dropped to a whisper. I'm going to burn him to the ground. Meanwhile, miles away in a luxurious estate, Andrew Dalton poured himself a glass of whiskey, smiling as he watched the news. Everything was falling into place. Wallace was finished. The FBI had what they needed. The media had moved on. And now, with Wallace out of the picture, his road to the White House was clear. Dalton took a slow sip, exhaling in satisfaction. This was the game, and he had won. But what he didn't know was that Richard Wallace wasn't dead yet. And when a man like Richard had nothing left to lose, he became the most dangerous man alive. The storm was coming, not the kind that rattled windows or flooded streets, but the kind that destroyed empires. And Richard Wallace was the storm. For weeks, he had plotted, planned, watched, and listened. He had played every angle inside that prison, aligning himself with the right people, feeding just enough information to the right guards, cutting just the right deals with Viktor Mikhailov. And now? Now it was time. Time to escape. Time to ruin Andrew Dalton. Time to take back everything. The night of the escape was silent. Richard lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling. Every muscle in his body was tense, waiting for the signal. Then, the power cut out. Just like before. The emergency backup lights flickered red. The guards scrambled, cursing as they tried to restore order. It was chaos, and chaos was exactly what Richard needed. A figure appeared outside his cell, a guard. But not just any guard. This was Victor's man. The keycard beeped. The cell door slid open. Richard stepped out, his heart pounding. No hesitation. No second thoughts. He moved. Every hallway had been mapped. Every blind spot memorized. 2 guards were waiting at the exit. They barely had time to react before a shiv was driven into one of their throats. The second turned, only to collapse as Victor himself cracked his skull against the wall. Move fast, Wallace, Victor grunted. I don't like waiting. Richard nodded. Trust me. Neither do I. They slipped through the last security checkpoint just as the sirens blared to life. The guards had realized. They had minutes, maybe seconds. A black van was waiting outside. Victor shoved Richard toward it. Remember our deal, Senator? Richard smirked. Oh, I never forget a deal. Then he disappeared into the van, and the night swallowed him whole. Richard Wallace was officially dead, and the hunt for him began. 6 weeks later, Washington, D.C. The presidential debate was about to begin. Senator Andrew Dalton stood behind the podium, smiling confidently as the cameras focused on him. The crowd cheered as the moderator spoke. Senator Dalton, you've built your campaign on the promise of restoring trust in government. Can you tell us what separates you from corrupt figures of the past? Dalton gave a practiced chuckle. Well, he said, the difference is simple. I believe in accountability. Unlike certain politicians, I don't lie to the American people. Applause. Dalton nodded, soaking in the moment. He had won. Richard Wallace was gone, rotting away in some unknown hellhole. Nothing could stop him now. But then, the big screen behind him flickered. The debate moderators frowned, glancing at their tech team. Then, a video started playing. The crowd gasped. Dalton froze, because on that screen was him, sitting across from an FBI agent, leaking information, making a deal, selling out Richard Wallace. And that wasn't all. The video kept playing. More evidence. Bank records. Wire transfers. Bribes. Proof of Dalton's own crimes. The crowd turned. Reporters scrambled for their phones. The moderator's face went pale. Dalton's campaign manager ran up to him, whispering furiously, "Shut it down. Now." But it was too late, because one last image appeared on the screen. A live feed of a man in a dark suit, sitting in an undisclosed location, smirking. A man the world believed to be dead. Richard Wallace. Dalton's throat went dry. His skin turned ghost white. The message on the screen was simple. I'm back. Dalton staggered back from the podium. The FBI stormed the stage. And in that moment, The entire world saw what he really was. Not a leader, not a future president, but a traitor, a criminal. And just like that, Andrew Dalton's empire collapsed. Hours later, in a hidden location, Richard Wallace sat in a leather chair, sipping a glass of whiskey, watching the news. Dalton had been arrested. His campaign was finished. His name was poison. Richard chuckled. He had won. But this wasn't the end. No, this was only the beginning. He was a ghost now. Free, powerful, untouchable. The world thought Richard Wallace was gone. But in reality, he was just getting started.